Professor Prakash, Professor Shanmugadas, Professor Narayan, my dear friend Dr. Murali, and all other dignitaries of stage, my dear students. It's a great honor for me to be here today. This rainy day, when April showers have come in May, bringing memories, of course, of my own wasteland classes, which I carried into this room. Memories which, as Eliot might say, are not all failed memories. So April might and might not be the cruelest month. But before I begin, I would like to congratulate Professor Prakash and his team for organizing a centenary celebration of this kind, because this is something that other university departments and colleges should also have taken up, but for some reason we have not been able to. So congratulations, sir. Congratulations, Shanmugadas sir, too. As I said, it's an honor to be here. I'll not begin with my title. In my ending will be my beginning, to misquote. I'll tell you the title of my paper in the end. I have been teaching the wasteland for many, many years now. And each class, I think, was a learning experience for me. A journey through the wasteland, in a sense, is a journey across my own life. But again, I must tell you that the reverence that Professor Prakash showed in talking about the wasteland is probably not going to be my tactic today. I'm going to practice irreverence too in looking at the wasteland. Now, when I say the journey of my life and the journey of my life across the wasteland, my life as a student, a teacher, a reader, as also someone who came in under the shadow of this red rock and discovered horror, as Professor Narayanan said, horror and fear, as also love and silence in its handful of broken images. It was also fear that this wasteland was growing all around me, that this wasteland was me. Ever since the time it was published 100 years ago, I think it's a text that has never stood alone. Always the text raised to the power of the text, or carrying a transtextuality par excellence, where I use Gerard Genet's definition of transtextuality as all that sets the text in a relationship, whether obvious or concealed, with other texts. The capacity of the wasteland, I mean, we are all in quest of the answer to the question of why the wasteland endures. The capacity of the wasteland to be in constant, diachronic, intersemiotic dialogue with other texts, social, literary, or cultural, that went before or after it. When I first read The Wasteland in 1990, the paratext alongside the epigraph, the horror which Professor Narayanan mentioned from Conrad's, again a text that I love, The Heart of Darkness, which was of course not published, nevertheless brought two images to my mind. which became my own epigraph to the world and the times that I was inhabiting at that point of time. The Norwegian artist Edvard Munch's painting, The Scream, that came in 1893. Can we? 1893, the next one. And the melting napalm girl, Phan Kim Phuc, running from the horror of the Vietnam War in 1972. Wasteland had given a poetic face to the infinite scream of terror that many of us heard resonating across the corridors of history. Now, this is where I agree with Conrad Aiken's review. It's a brilliant review, of course, which came just a few months after the publication of The Wasteland, The Anatomy of Melancholy, published in the New Republic on February 7th, 1923. A few months after the publication of The Wasteland, Conrad Aiken says, "The Wasteland is an epic in a walnut shell." Aiken says that, I quote him, "Mr. Eliot's net is wide, and he catches a good deal more than he pretends to, creating a poem that has an emotional value far clearer and richer than its arbitrary and rather unworkable logical value." Aiken summed it up when he said, "The Wasteland's brilliant and kaleidoscopic confusion echoed the confusions of the 20th century, giving chance correlations or conglomerating mutually discolorative fragments out of the heap of broken images." It was indeed, for me and for many in my class, all of us who together read The Wasteland, a magic lantern that threw our nerves in a pattern on the screen. Of course, Wasteland succeeds, as time is testimony, or as Aiken would say, by virtue of its incoherence and of its plan, by virtue of its ambiguities, not of its explanations. However, I've divided my talk into two parts. The first is largely theoretical, and the second is what I would like to call affective. Now, I do not agree with Aiken's contention that Eliot had made a literature of literature, an idolatry of literature, a poetry actuated not more by life itself than by poetry. This is where I think I need to come back to the point I made about the intersemiotic transtextuality, where Gennett's 5 categories of transtextuality is what makes the mosaic of The Wasteland so complex. It has architextuality, where it has accessed and served as a textual archetype. There is hypertextuality, where it is a text with a network of links to other texts, a networked all the more so, I think, in the new registers of the digital. If you Google The Wasteland now, you will see the immense possibilities that the digital has opened up in the reading of the Wasteland, where it reinvents itself in the networked terrains of the cyber. It is also intertextual, a text present within another, embedded and embedding various social, cultural, and literary texts. Paratextuality, of course, I need not mention the various epigraphs, notes, Eliot's notes, his letters with Ezra Pound, footnotes, bibliography, all of which offer a rich paratextual experience. Metatextuality, I think, is significant, wherein it is also a text that comments on its earlier readings with an incredulity, I think, towards itself. Again, reinventing itself in the postmodern. So even as we have the title of the wasteland as, the modernists speak, I think it has also reinvented itself across ages, which is one point that I particularly want to concentrate today. The wasteland is as modernist as it is postmodernist in its originary impulses, structural incoherences, affective registers, and so on and so forth, yielding as easily to carefully crafted structurations while holding on to modernism's affective lament and its sense of tragic alienation. But that does not mean that it is utterly devoid of a postmodern celebration of its fragmentation, provisionality, of its incoherence, or that the post-structuralist play with language is completely absent. Let us take, for example, the identity of Tiresias, ambivalently poised between sexes, genders, ages, sensibilities. Who is he, she, they? Tiresias is what Tiresias sees. Thus, in a sense, Tiresias is language itself. The unconscious of the text of Wasteland is structured like the language of Tiresias, the language that he sees or he utters. The fundamental binary structure, which in fact underpins the history of philosophy, which conceives the world in terms of a system of oppositions proliferating without end, logos, pathos, soul, body, self, other, good, evil, culture, nature, man, woman, understanding, perception, inside, outside, memory, oblivion, speech, writing. All this get undermined in the twilight hour of Tiresian conscious unconscious. I would call Tiresias a Derridian trace, for he, she, foregrounds a conceptual or historical dependence between the present and absent concepts, leading, I think, partly to the dismantling of a logocentric binary or logocentric binary categories or distinct identities and irreducible alterity, as also maybe the possible recuperation of voices that have been silenced and excluded in metaphysical thought. Consider the lines from a game of chess. My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak? What are you thinking of? What thinking? What? I never know what you're thinking. Think? I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. There are so many voices here. Definitely Vivian Haywood Eliot himself, the girl in the hyacinth garden, of course, the man in the hyacinth garden, the Phlebas, the Phoenician sailor. Sometimes I even think Madame Sosostris. Here is a Derridian difference constituting meaning and identities through an interplay of difference, of differ and distinction as different, with the result that the trace and absence become part of the sign and part of the presence. Without the absent presence of Tiresias, these voices can never be heard, nor can any sense of meaning be patched. In Eliot's logocentric metaphysical epistemology, alongside what could be called a Manichaean self-other dialectic, the alterity of the other is viewed as irreducible and absolute. Think of, these are all words and phrases that continue to haunt me. The hooded hordes, the modern day nymphs who are departed and their friends, the loitering heirs of city directors, Mrs. Porter and her daughter who washed their feet in soda water, the unshaven Mr. Eugenides. The small house agent's clerk with one bold stare, one of the low on whom assurance sits as a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. I mean, such phrases that actually upset you, more so today than ever. It all reveals the metaphysical logocentrism engendering suspicion, superiority, and hierarchy that is at the core of the wasteland. It's something that I keep on discussing with my students. In spite of its professed empathy, wasteland slips, where otherness is indeed seen through the lens of logocentrism and is marked as irreconcilable alterity and inferiority. No attempt to co-opt Tiresias into this logocentric schema can mask the difference, supplementarity, and trace in the poem which its language lays bare. There are gaping fissures in the metaphysical structures that produce alienation and estrangement, making possible the very wasteland whose creation is then lamented. So this is a point that I really wanted to stress. Think, for example, about these lines. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stones no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I'll show you something different from either. Your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. However, this shadow, Eliot's shadow of the red rock, all come undone as we realize that this shadow is cast only in relation to the real world of the wasteland and mirrors, in a sense, its hegemonic values, its institutional structures, cultural norms, and linguistic patterns. Thus, the central dichotomy of the wasteland between fertility and barrenness, order and chaos, seem to purport a very structured text. We assume that Tiresias is a central logic of the poem, one that gives it its meaning and its tone of lament. As Eliot says in his notes, I quote, Tiresias, although a mere spectator and not indeed a character, is yet the most important personage in the poem, uniting all the rest, unquote. However, Tiresias as a Derridian trace always already signifies an absence that comes to haunt the present. But other signifiers too come to inhabit this present, such as words from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Datta, Dayatvam, Damyata, and Shanti, in what the Thunder said. What is interesting is that the plurality of meanings that these words foreground, the interpretations, the play, in all these, they escape the transcendental signifier, unleashing difference upon the text. Thus, meaning does not and cannot reside in Tiresias, nor can he be the transcendental signifier. Think of these lines. These fragments I have showed against my ruins. Why then it'll fit you? Hieronymus mad again. Datta, Damyata, Dayatvam, Damyata, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Now, I think this is the aporia of the wasteland, a point where the text exhibits deconstructive characteristics, dismantling itself or undermining its own rhetorical foundations. The multiple possibilities, the different underlying meaning cause the text to deconstruct its unity and establish a perplexity or paradox by saying what isn't overtly authored in the text. Here, I think, is difference destabilizing the structure and its structurality collapse in the end, leaving both the reader and the text on tenuous, tentative, and shifting grounds. How can Tiresias, the one who gives meaning to the heap of broken images, one who is blind but is attributed with prophetic vision, one who has neither given nor sympathized or controlled, fix the meaning of Datta, Dayatvam, and Damyata? It is Prajapati, the king of gods, who undertakes the performative act of speaking the words da, da, da. Yet, the specific empirical moment of the inception and inscription of these words exceeds the moment and the speaker, spilling out into the future where Prajapati can neither control its meaning nor their destiny. Now, in a sense, Konrad Aiken, if you go back to 1923, Konrad Aiken puts it in a different manner in those times when he asks, I quote, "Why again Datta, Dayatvam, Damyata, or Shanti? Do they not say a good deal less for us than give, sympathize, control, or peace? Of course. But Mr. Eliot replies that he wants them not merely to mean these particular things, but also to mean them in a particular way. That is to be remembered in connection with the Upanishads. Unfortunately, we have none of us this memory, nor can he give it to us, and in the upshot he gives us only a series of agreeable sounds which might as well have been nonsense. What we get at, and I think it is important, is that in none of these particular cases does the reference, the allusion, justify itself intrinsically, make itself felt. When we are aware of these references at all, sometimes they are unidentifiable. We are aware of them simply as something unintelligible but suggestive. Professor Prakash did mention that, Eliot's take on what poetry should be, how it should communicate. I continue with this, a slightly long quote, because I think it's very important. When they have been explained, we are aware of the material referred, the fact, for instance, a vegetation ceremony, as something useless for our enjoyment or understanding of the poem, something distinctly dragged in and only perhaps of interest as having suggested a pleasantly ambiguous line. For unless an allusion is made to live identifiably, to flower where transplanted, it is otiose. We admit the beauty of the implicational or allusive method, but the key to an implication should not be in the implication itself, nor outside it. Now, he says that we do admit the value of this esoteric pattern, but the pattern should disclose its secret, should not be dependent on a cipher. So he calls Eliot a little pretentious there, because he says he's a little pretentious in his plan. If it is a plan, then its principle is oddly akin to planlessness. He also says that here and there in the wilderness, Mr. Eliot offers us a broken finger post. I think these broken finger posts are interesting from a post-structuralist perspective too, for fixing the context of Datta, Damyata, and Dayatvam, and Shanti to the Upanishad is to tacitly introduce a politics. Derrida says that there is always something political in any attempt to fix a context. Such experience is always political because it implies, insofar as it involves determination, a certain type of non-natural relationship to others. Now, Eliot's determination of the Upanishadic context brings into existence a social structure or a set of relations that do not exist prior to this event in the text and thereby can be seen as non-natural. So this exploration of Wasteland's modernist, postmodernist, post-structuralist journey in a sense, which it could continue ad infinitum given the complex density of the text. We could keep on talking about it theoretically. However, as a teacher, I have seen Wasteland's images resonate with a psychical and affective energy that goes far beyond its ideological, poetic, and aesthetic impact. This is why I could never say how the poem could impact different students in a class. For many, the wasteland had become a parable, taking on a rhetorical function of denunciation of the ecological devastation of the world that the world has undergone in the last century till the pandemic. That is why, as Professor Narayanan mentioned, a resurgence of interest in the wasteland. In a sense, it is also a poem that exhorts to respond to important ethical questions, moral questions regarding the lives of excess that that are part and parcel of our modern day lives. In this sense, Wasteland has negotiated a series of what I call dietic temporal shifts that permit the reader to use it as a symbol, a metaphor, a parable, or even an ur-text, a primitive, seminal, or prototypical text to explore the past and the future of life and humanity. Consider lines such as, Phlebas the Phoenician, a fortnight dead. Forgot the cry of gulls and the deep sea swell, and the profit and loss. One can see here the invocation of archetypal memories and primitive bodily perceptions. There is a certain helplessness that confronts many of my student readers as they grapple with the multiple possibilities of the wasteland. Andrew Ross calls this helplessness as necessarily inscribed in or provoked by the conventional procedures of interpretation, linking it up symptomatically with a more chronic impossibility of articulating history itself. History is impossible to articulate, as we all know. So this helplessness also comes out of this impossibility of attempting to articulate history. This is definitely a characteristic feature of high modernist writing. But like me, like the generations of students who have studied Wasteland, the text always ends up with attempts to relate both effectively and theoretically the fragments of our own personal histories with a vast canvas of general historical conditions. This, I think, is what makes the Wasteland so enduring in spite of its incoherence and obscurity. Now, in 1993, when Kevin Carter's picture of the famine-stricken Sudanese child with the vulture waiting to feed on her, this photo gave a new meaning to my wasteland, connecting the personal with the larger political wasteland. If there were rock and also water, a spring, a pool among the rock, if there were the sound of water only, not the cicada and the dry grass singing, but sound of water over a rock where the hermit thrush sings in the pine trees, drip, drop, drip, drop, drop, drop. But there is no water. In March 1994, this photo won the Pulitzer Prize for feature photography. 2 months after receiving the prize, Carter took his own life. Like the hero of T.V. Chandran's Kathavisheshan in 2004, who took his life out of the sheer shame of being alive after witnessing the Gujarat carnage, deciding to end the condition of being human. The reader of the Wasteland too was more dead than ever. Eliot always speaks about two kinds of death, death in life and life in death. So it was always preferential to cover oneself with forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. In 2000, I watched Samira Makmalma's movie, Black Boats, a metaphorical fable of Iranian Kurds in a rugged mountain war zone with little children selling contraband, children who had lost their limbs, children who were gathering bombs and mines, all in search of the border amongst the winding, sterile, brown mountain trails between Iran and Iraq, all at war with one another. No food, no water, but war. Again, here is no water, but only rock. Rock and no water, and the sandy road. The road winding above among the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water. It continues. There is not even silence in the mountains. Watch this movie, and I know again and again, lines from the wasteland, were ringing in my ears as I watched this. Dry, sterile thunder without rain. There is not even solitude in the mountains, but red, sullen faces sneer and snarl. So here was, for my own journey with the wasteland, here was the wasteland taking another multidisciplinary hermeneutic turn to post-structuralist culture studies. The dead mountain mouths of carious teeth and their sterile hopelessness took another turn in 2001 with the destruction of Bamiyan Buddha in Afghanistan. The dead mountain mouths of carious teeth which cannot even spit. Later too in 2003 with the Iraq war operations so trenchantly titled Red Dawn. Datta, what have we given? My friend, blood shaking my heart, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this and this only have we existed. If these lines had a face in 2002 in my classroom, it was that of Qutbuddin Ansari. A photo that rocked our conscience, the face of what men gave each other and how Damyata was a far call. Many cruel Aprils came and went. Many students had tears in their eyes as we read The Wasteland together. We were all moved beyond comprehension by the landscape of barren waste and our own death in life conditions. And somewhere, dull roots were stirring with spring rain. Yet, we returned to our dried, tuberous, dull lives. But in 2015, Aylan Kurdi unsettled our wasteland. Shelley's blue Mediterranean was awakened from its summer dreams, and Aylan lay, lulled by the coil of his crystalline streams. The politics of the wasteland had shifted again to larger ideological global battles over land and water. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence of the gardens and the agony in stony places, the shouting and crying, prison and palace and reverberation of thunder of spring over distant mountains. He who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying with a little patience. The maternal lamentations, Gandhari Vilapam as Professor Narayanan called it, amidst the murmur of maternal lamentations high in the air, Aylan Kurdi was resurrected, walking along the reader of the wasteland, his child red tunic replacing the brown mantle. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you. Who is that on the other side of you? But we covered ourselves again in forgetfulness. We were the quintessential tourists to the Hyacinth Garden. We celebrated Tuvana Tumbigal and Ennu Ninda Swandam Moideen, but the mind was squandered in booming marriage markets, jewelry ads, and spectacular wedding regalia. When offered love, as the protagonist of The Wasteland said, I could not speak, and my eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing. looking into the heart of light, the silence. Then came the flood, and again floods, and then the pandemic. Ganga was sunken, and the limp leaves waited for rain, while the black clouds gathered far distant over Himvant. The jungle crouched, hummed in silence, then spoke the thunder. But then we could not understand the language of thunder, for we knew nothing of the history that repeats itself, first as tragedy and then as farce. Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? I remember those are pearls that were his eyes. Are you alive or not? A student who was forced into marriage halfway through her MA told me that nothing in the wasteland made more sense to her than these lines from a game of chess. What shall I do now? What shall I do? I shall rush out as I am and walk the street with my hair down. So, what shall we do tomorrow? What shall we ever do? I was just dwelling upon the affective and intersemiotic registers that the wasteland taps, from cinema to music to painting to photography, traversing disciplines and destinies, both political and personal. Malayalis, born in a land made and unmade by water, inhabiting a region of myths, a waterlogged soil, nurtured and wounded by rivers like Periyar, Bharatapuzha, Meenachil, Achankovil, and many others, along with hundreds of small tributaries and canals. This epic unfolding of a map of wasteland, its cartographic excess of barrenness and sterility might miss the metaphor. But as we row as readers unsuspectingly into the wasteland, we find out that one is actually rowing into the memory of a character who also epitomizes the historical and mythical moments and journeys of all rivers, all waters, in fact, all cradles of civilizations, from Nile to Euphrates, Tigris, Mississippi, or Nila. The wasteland is as much a reflection on the act of narration as it is an ensemble of history, memory, and mythology. But like the Sibyl of Cumae, in spite of our death wishes, or like Tiresias who foresuffered, we are not allowed respite from this land into which we go further and further, into the unexplored terrains of its collective unconscious, its ancient memories, its pagan rituals, its foreboding language of the prophets of the Old Testament, finding at each turn the infinite desolation of its inhabitants. I want to conclude by arguing that the enduring edifice of the wasteland is partly owing to this mythopoiesis of affect and thought that it creates, an affective objective correlative, as you may call it. Just need to explain that a little bit. The dissociation of sensibility Eliot argued against and tried to supplant with a fusion of thought and feeling that finds its acme in objective correlatives, or what he defines as a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which shall be the formula of that particular emotion that the poet feels and hopes to evoke in the reader. However, Eliot's contention that Hamlet is an artistic failure because both the man and Shakespeare were dominated by an emotion which is inexpressible, because it is in excess of the fact as they appear. An emotion which can find no outlet in action. An emotion which cannot express in art an intense feeling, ecstatic or terrible, without an object or exceeding its object seems indicated in Wasteland 2, as in Hamlet. Wasteland also has intense feelings, which in spite of all its brilliant objective correlatives, in spite of all its mosaic of allusions and mythopoeic structure, far exceeds them, I think. But then, I argue that it is this emotional excess that is in search of readerly objective correlatives that is behind Wasteland's phenomenal success. As I try to illustrate, readers find their own objective correlatives for the intensities of the poem that the poem creates, oftentimes neither aesthetic nor literary, yet ones that touch their individual angst, connecting through affect, hence affective objective correlatives, where affect, as Sarah Ahmed would argue, does not reside in an object or sign, but is an affect of the circulation between objects and signs. I want to conclude on that note with my title, Which Wasteland Did You Then Read, You Hypocrite Reader? Thank you.